Greetings, my name is Travis Tennant. I am an assistant professor in animal science at West Texas A&M University. West Texas University is a university that's very passionate to me. I have my undergraduate and my graduate degree from this university. I have a doctoral degree from NC State University as well. And my area of emphasis would be meat science. We're going to look at the value of a beef carcass in the United States, and also look at the relative primals that come off of that carcass and how they're fabricated at a major packer in the United States. And to do that, we refer to IMPS, which stands for Institutional Meat Purchasing Specifications. They're a written set of guidelines that help the producer and the consumer and the packer communicate a particular cut from that carcass. That ensures that whenever a food service entity, a consumer, or a further processor request a certain code, that they get the same product or have a consistent product every time they make that purchase. In the US, when we look at a beef carcass, that beef carcass would be broken down into various primals. Those primals are large muscle cuts that are then fabricated into further subprimals and retail cuts. In the US, those primals are the round. So starting from the end of the animal, we have the round, sirloin, loin, rib, chuck, brisket, shank, plate, and flank. So from those various primals, we would get subprimals and retail, and ultimately retail cuts. So common retail cuts that a consumer can identify with obviously would be the middle meats, or what we largely regard as steaks that come off of that animal. So the ribeye, or the strip steak, Kansas City steak, New York strip steak, would all be different names for a strip loin. From there, we also have sirloin and tenderloin that makes up the middle meats of that carcass. If we look at the round, the round is often identified as where roast would be or would come from off of that animal. And then we have the chuck. The chuck is generally regarded as a large source of trimmings or ground beef products that would be generated from that primal. Think of when you go to the retail store and you look in the retail case, you'll see ground beef chuck or ground chuck as an option for you to purchase. When we look at value of those various primals and overall economic value of that carcass, we can look at the difference or the inverse relationship to weight of a certain cut or a certain IMPS code versus the value or dollar that is given or price per a pound of that cut. If we look at the first quarter value, or 25% value of that carcass, is derived from two IMPS codes. One would be a ribeye roll. So a ribeye roll is something you're familiar with as a steak that has a high cost per a pound. Typically, it would be greater than $10 if we look at the average price across the United States as far as retail is concerned. In comparison to ground beef would be the other. So ground beef is typically a lower value item. If we look at the cost for that item per pound, it is relatively about $3.50. There is some spread depending on what level of fat to lean is present in those trimmings. In a carcass, ground beef approximately accounts for 18 to 20% of that carcass. When we look at the relative weight of a ribeye roll, it would be in the range between 5 to 6% of that carcass. So between the two, you can see how important it is to either be heavy in quantity or to have a high price point. To transition from fabrication and to value, we also talked about, or want to talk about, consumer misconceptions or consumer trends and current topics. If we look back at 2012, one of the most recent misconceptions or misnomers would have been in relation to lean, finely textured beef, which was manufactured by Beef Products Incorporated. Lean, finely textured beef is a product that is manufactured from fat and bone trimmings, to which we separate the lean from the fat and bone, and through a mechanical process add food safety hurdles. So if you remember to 2012, the biggest issue with lean, finely textured beef was that we were adding ammonia to that mixture. Ammonia in this case, or ammonium hydroxide, has been approved from the FDA since 1974 as a food safety ingredient to incorporate in everything from bakery goods to meat products. It is utilized in that process to control E. coli, which is a pathogenic organism that has been shown to be harmful to humans. So in this process, we use this as an intervention strategy. This is just one area to which we need to inform consumer bases about overall practices and processes and become more transparent with our base as a means to effectively communicating how the beef industry is trying to be as sustainable as possible. So ensuring that all skeletal tissue, or meat in this instance, enters the food system as opposed to going to a waste product. There are other current trends that are growing, but by and large, it is important to remember that they represent the minority. When we look at a consumer and consumer demand, it is driven by a positive eating satisfaction and quality, but the most important mechanism in that relationship is also cost. The beef industry is very, very efficient at producing an economical product, but there is a growing segment that looks at other values such as NHTC, which is non-hormone treated cattle. There's a growing demand for organic beef, grass-fed beef, and these are all kind of linked together as a food trend currently. Separate conversation in that would be that we're also in an area where we're looking at clean labeling from a consumer standpoint, and how can we add value to a beef animal by making value-added products. Value-added products are further processed meat products. And so when we look at beef and value-adding beef products, these are how do we make products that are more convenient to the consumer. We are now in a society where consumer convenience is becoming an important concept to embrace. More so, we are now seeing changes in generations. There are more people that eat away from home that eat at home. So it is an important to kind of target all demographics when we look at this growing segment and look at how to embrace those changes in the future. When we look at primal cuts, we can start with the round. So out of the round primal, we would break that into other sub-primal cuts. Most notably would be top round, bottom round, the eye of round, and the knuckle. And those can then be fabricated into smaller portions such as roast. So your London broil, your top round roast, bottom round roast, eye of round steaks would all come from this primal. If we look and move on down to the next primal, looking at the sirloin has mainly, or the top sirloin butt as it's referred to, can be broken down into several retail cuts. If we take the top cap of the beef sirloin off, we would get what's referred to as the picanha, or a culotte steak, depending on how it would be processed. Further on, we would take that primal and make steaks. So top sirloin steaks would come out of course, the sirloin itself. If we further process that down and looking at how to add value, more specifically looking at how do we create portion control, we would take that sirloin and portion it into 4 to 6 ounce servings and serve that as a baseball sirloin or a petite sirloin. Looking at the full loin, one thing to note about the full loin is that in the full loin contains the sirloin, the strip loin, and the tenderloin. During processing, we have to make a decision on how we further fabricate the full loin. If we want to make T-bones and porterhouses, we would leave the tenderloin on the full loin and process that into those steaks. If we're looking at how do we manufacture or fabricate a fillet, we would remove the tenderloin from the full loin and further process that into fillets or roast. Looking at the loin itself, the loin contains the strip loin. We can also leave that as a bone-in product and would make T-bone steaks. In addition, if we take and make a boneless product, we have a strip loin or a Kansas City strip, a New York strip, or a Las Vegas strip. All are the same term for that piece. Looking at the rib, of course, the most synonymous item coming out of the rib would be the rib eye, typically left as a boneless item cut into rib eye steaks. During that fabrication process, we also generate rib lifter meat as well as the back ribs. The chuck primal is broken down into several different retail cuts. The biggest retail cut in terms of weight that would come out of the chuck primal would be the chuck eye roll. A current trend now is to break the chuck eye roll down into chuck eye steaks. Another famous cut from the chuck is the Flatiron. Adjacent to the Flatiron would also be the mock tender. If it is during grilling season, you might find the Southwest Griller or the Terry's Major or Petite Tender, which comes from underneath the scapula and would be adjacent to the Denver cut. The rest of the chuck is made into ground chuck or into a ground beef item. If we look at the brisket as a primal, the brisket itself is kind of a standalone item. We can sell or package that brisket the way that it comes off the animal, and that we refer to that as a packer cut brisket. Another popular way of processing or fabricating that brisket would be to remove the point or the fatty tip of that brisket, leaving what's referred to as the flat. The two cuts that were often found in the plate would be the inside skirt as well as the short ribs. The rest of the value of the plate is sold as a ground beef item. Looking at the flank primal, there are two areas of the flank to which we generate retail cuts from. Obviously, the namesake of the flank primal, the flank itself, as well as the outside skirt. So while live cattle evaluation is a very important tool, equally as important to look at carcass conformation, fabrication, and yield value. One of the most important takeaways is we can only do so much from an evaluation standpoint of the live animal. Really, once we have harvested that animal is when we'll determine more in terms of conformation and yield. As a surprise to us when purchasing these animals, you would have noticed, or you will notice, that two of those animals would have qualified as 30 months or above, signifying that they had dentition in this instance to qualify them into that designation. Therefore, those animals would not be eligible for young beef grades. In this instance, the Corriente would have graded a commercial because of its age, and the Charlet would have also graded a standard due to its ossification or age. When we look at the carcasses, you will notice that there is a difference not only in size and frame of these animals that we evaluated, but also we get in terms of the carcass differences in dressing percent or red meat value. All 4 of the carcasses had a dressing percent of 65%. However, when we look at the red meat yield of those animals, there is a dramatic spread in the red meat percentage of those carcasses. The animal with the highest percentage, the Charolais, had a red meat yield of 63%. The lowest yielding animal in terms of red meat yield would have been the Akaushi at 53%. Largely, the change in red meat yield is a function of muscle to fat. An important criteria when evaluating a beef carcass would be the relationship of muscle to fat and also the relationship of muscle to bone. When determining the value of a beef carcass, there are 2 methods commonly used. One would be to sell the live animal at a live weight. The second would be to use a carcass grid-based system to which that animal is paid a premium or a discount based upon how that animal grades. When we look at the economics of the carcasses, we can get a better understanding of the importance of when to sell an animal live versus when is better to sell an animal on the grid. Of the 4 carcasses, you'll notice that 2 would have been high quality. The Akaushi and the Jersey Cross both would have fallen in the category of choice. Based upon that designation, it would have been more beneficial for a producer to sell that carcass on a grid-based system, as those animals would have received a premium for being higher quality. When we look at the other 2 animals, the Corriente and the Charolais, you will notice that because of their advanced maturity, but also in the Charolais case of being a lower quality animal, the producer would have received a higher value if he had sold that animal live. When determining overall value, depending on which method was used to sell that animal, the profit that is generated is the value derived from the red meat yield, or the value that comes from the retail cuts of that animal versus the method to which that animal was sold. In the cases of the 4 animals sold, depending on how they were marketed, 2 animals in this class would have received a profit, and we would have taken a loss on 2 animals. This is a great example of that we don't always know what we are purchasing until it is harvested.